October 16th, 2025. A cold wind swept over the broken fields of southern Ukraine. Near the village of Pokrovsk, investigators walked through the blackened remains of yet another Russian drone strike. Twisted metal, shattered fragments of composite, wings, and pieces of electronics littered the ground like scattered bones. But this wreckage was different. Among the debris lay a cluster of small, tennis ball-sized bomblets, each one stamped with markings written not in Cyrillic, but in Hangul, the Korean alphabet. The discovery was immediate and chilling. Russia wasn't just using North Korean artillery shells anymore. It had begun arming its drones with North Korean cluster munitions. For months, Western intelligence had warned that Pyongyang was quietly supplying Moscow with ammunition and rockets to feed its war machine. But no one imagined the partnership would evolve this far. What investigators found in that Ukrainian field was more than just evidence of cooperation. It was proof of a terrifying new weapon combination that could rewrite modern warfare. A cheap drone carrying an illegal cluster bomb. The moment the photos of the debris surfaced online, analysts from NATO to Seoul began tracing the weapon's origin. Satellite imagery, intercepted shipments, and recovered shell casings pointed toward the same conclusion. North Korea had been sending Russia not just bullets and shells, but entire pallets of submunitions, the small explosive bomblets used inside cluster bombs. Experts identified the design as nearly identical to the PTAB 2.5 KO, a type of submunition long associated with North Korea's stockpile. It was crude, deadly, and inexpensive. But when attached to a drone, suddenly it became something else entirely. To understand why this combination was so alarming, you need to understand what a cluster weapon is, and why it's been banned by most of the world. Cluster munitions are not single bombs. They are containers filled with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of smaller explosives. When deployed, the container opens mid-air, scattering the submunitions over a wide area. Each bomblet is designed to detonate on impact, creating a rain of explosions that can destroy vehicles, shred infantry, and devastate everything in a football field-sized radius. In open warfare, they're terrifyingly effective. But the horror comes later. Many of those bomblets don't explode immediately. They lie hidden in the soil, waiting, sometimes for years, until a farmer's tractor or a child's step sets them off. That's why over 120 countries signed the Convention on Cluster Munitions, banning their use. Russia, North Korea, and the United States are not among them. For decades, cluster weapons were delivered by aircraft, artillery, or large rockets, systems that required coordination and logistics. But drones have changed everything. Suddenly, a weapon that once required a bomber can be carried by a machine the size of a suitcase. And when the cost of that drone is under $500, the math of war changes dramatically. Military analysts call it asymmetric efficiency. A traditional warfare is expensive. Jets cost millions, missiles tens of thousands. But if you can build a drone for a few $100s and strap to it a handful of submunitions that cost even less, you've created a low-cost, high-impact weapon. For Russia, bleeding resources in Ukraine, this combination is a strategic dream. For Ukraine and for international law, it's a nightmare. By late September 2025, Ukrainian air defense units had already noticed changes in Russia's drone strikes. The explosions were different, more widespread, more erratic. Instead of a single impact crater, there were dozens of smaller ones, spread like a constellation across the target zone. In some cases, the drones seemed to hover briefly before releasing their deadly payloads. It wasn't until investigators recovered the fragments in October that the full picture became clear. These weren't standard warheads. They were modified cluster dispersal units. Each of these Russian drones carried roughly 10 to 15 submunitions, individually small, but collectively capable of blanketing an entire street or trench line with explosions. The submunitions bore telltale signs of North Korean manufacturing, simplified fuse designs, cheap cast metal casings, and a distinctive marking pattern that matched earlier samples recovered from North Korean artillery shells used by Russia earlier that year. The message was unmistakable. North Korea had crossed yet another red line, supplying not just ammunition, but internationally banned weapons, and Russia was happy to use them. In Moscow's eyes, this partnership was practical. Russia's domestic industry has been under immense strain. Sanctions have crippled its ability to produce precision-guided munitions at scale. Drones, especially the Iranian-designed Shahed series, became its cheap substitute. But the Shahed's explosive payload was limited, and using them against hardened Ukrainian positions wasn't cost-effective. The solution? Replace the warhead with cluster submunitions, cheap, plentiful, devastatingly effective against infantry. With North Korea's help, that solution became real. But for Ukraine, the consequences are human. When cluster weapons are used in cities, the effects linger long after the battle. In areas like Kherson and Kharkiv, demining teams have already been struggling to clear unexploded ordnance. Now, the introduction of Korean-made bomblets, many of which are poorly constructed and prone to duds, means thousands more unexploded charges scattered across farmland and villages. Each one a potential death trap. International condemnation was swift. The United Nations called the reports deeply alarming. The European Union demanded an immediate investigation. Even countries that had remained cautious about directly confronting Pyongyang began voicing concern. But for Russia and North Korea, the outrage was irrelevant. Both nations are already under heavy sanctions. Both are isolated. And both see this war as a proving ground, a laboratory for testing weapons that the rest of the world forbids. The psychology behind this partnership runs deeper than economics. North Korea's regime has long sought validation as a weapons power. Selling arms to Russia gives it something priceless: relevance. For decades, Pyongyang's weapons exports were confined mostly to rogue states and militant groups. Now, one of the world's largest militaries is deploying its ammunition on a European battlefield, and doing so publicly. It's a propaganda victory that Kim Jong-un could never have achieved through diplomacy. Meanwhile, the Russian military gains a source of munitions it desperately needs. North Korea's factories, though outdated, operate around the clock. They produce artillery shells, rockets, and submunitions by the millions, far more than Russia's sanctioned economy can currently manage. And because the North Korean designs are simple, they can be adapted to almost any delivery system, including small drones. What Moscow loses in precision, it gains in volume. But make no mistake, this isn't just a tactical innovation. It's an escalation of ethical warfare itself. The use of cluster munitions from a drone blurs the lines between conventional combat and terror tactics. Unlike a missile strike, which has a defined target, a drone can loiter, hunt, and release bomblets over any area it pleases. The psychological effect is profound. Soldiers and civilians alike never know if the buzzing above them is surveillance or death. Reports from Ukrainian front lines describe drones approaching silently, hovering for several seconds, then releasing a cascade of bomblets that scatter in every direction. Some explode instantly, others lie in the dirt, undetonated, waiting for the slightest touch. One Ukrainian medic described it as a rain of invisible grenades. Another called it a horror that keeps coming back days later. As word spread of these attacks, military strategists began to debate the long-term implications. The combination of drones and cluster weapons represents more than just an upgrade. It's a revolution in low-cost warfare. With enough production, any nation could replicate it. Terror groups, militias, or rogue states could use similar methods to terrorize civilian populations without ever owning aircraft or missiles. The barrier to entry has effectively disappeared. Western intelligence agencies are already warning that this model could inspire copycats. A drone capable of carrying a few kilograms of explosives is no longer advanced technology. It's commercial. Add improvised submunitions, and you've created a weapon of mass disruption. The concern isn't just what Russia is doing in Ukraine, it's what others might do next. But even beyond the battlefield, the geopolitical consequences are severe. Russia and North Korea's partnership directly challenges decades of non-proliferation efforts. It undermines the fragile balance maintained by international treaties and weakens the moral authority of the United Nations. Each North Korean shell fired in Ukraine sends a message. The old rules of warfare no longer apply when desperate regimes cooperate. By late October, US intelligence confirmed that at least 3 separate drone attacks had used Korean-made submunitions. One was near Mykolaiv, another near Dnipro, and a third in the Donetsk region. In each case, investigators recovered fragments that matched the same Korean design. The scale of the cooperation was growing. Satellite images showed trains crossing the Russia-North Korea border more frequently than ever before. Each convoy carried containers marked for agricultural equipment. But analysts knew better. These were weapon shipments, ammunition, shells, and now components for illegal cluster bombs. Behind closed doors, NATO's intelligence community began to assess what this meant for global warfare. Cluster weapons are not new, but their delivery by autonomous or semi-autonomous drones is. In traditional use, these munitions are part of a broader tactical plan. Drones, however, operate independently. They can be deployed en masse, guided by AI-assisted systems, and even coordinated to strike from multiple directions simultaneously. The result is chaos, an overwhelming, unpredictable rain of destruction that conventional defenses struggle to stop. And that brings us to the moral core of this story. What happens when legality, morality, and practicality collide on the battlefield? Russia argues that it is merely responding to Ukraine's own use of cluster munitions supplied by the United States. Indeed, Washington confirmed that it had delivered limited stocks of such weapons earlier in 2024, arguing they were needed to break through entrenched Russian positions. But there is a key difference. The US munitions were precision-delivered, tightly controlled, and documented. Russia's use of North Korean bomblets through cheap drones is anything but controlled. It's indiscriminate, chaotic, and deliberately deniable. In war, every escalation demands justification. Moscow insists it is doing what the West already did. But in truth, it's erasing the distinction between tactical necessity and war crime. Each time one of these drones takes flight, it carries not just explosives, but the weight of global precedent. If Russia normalizes this tactic, other nations will follow. The result could be an era where low-cost drone warfare makes every city, every battlefield, and every border a potential target. By November, humanitarian groups working in Ukraine began sounding the alarm. Children had been injured by unexploded bomblets found in fields. Farmers were abandoning their land out of fear. The unexploded rate of North Korean submunitions, according to field reports, was as high as 30%. That means nearly 1/3 of the bomblets failed to detonate immediately. Each one a deadly remnant of a battle long over. The cost of clearing them will take years, maybe decades. But for those who designed and deployed them, that was never the concern. In Moscow, the partnership with Pyongyang continues to deepen. There are rumors of joint production facilities being planned inside Russian territory, where North Korean technicians oversee manufacturing of both artillery shells and submunitions. The move would allow Russia to bypass international monitoring entirely. It would also give North Korea a foothold in a European war it can publicly deny but privately profit from. Western nations are now faced with a dilemma. Sanctions have already reached their limits. Diplomatic condemnation achieves little. So how do you deter two regimes that have nothing left to lose? The uncomfortable truth is that this new weapon combination, the cheap drone and the illegal cluster bomb, may be unstoppable in the short term. Technology has democratized destruction. Anyone with access to basic components can now assemble a system capable of inflicting mass casualties. That's not just a military challenge, it's an existential one for global security. The discovery in that Ukrainian field was more than evidence. It was a warning, a signal that the boundaries of war are dissolving faster than international law can keep up. Drones once used for surveillance are now instruments of indiscriminate terror. Cluster bombs once condemned to history are returning, smaller and cheaper than ever before, and the nations responsible feel no shame because their partnership is built on necessity, not morality. When historians look back on this war, they might not remember every battle or every front line. But they will remember this moment, the day Russia and North Korea showed the world how easy it is to break the rules when the world's enforcement is broken. The day a $500 drone carrying a handful of illegal submunitions changed the face of warfare forever. Because what's been unleashed now cannot be contained. Every drone factory, every black market dealer, every state desperate for leverage is watching. They've learned that legality doesn't matter, only effectiveness does. And if one small drone can scatter a dozen bomblets across a town square, imagine what a swarm of 100 could do. The future of war won't be defined by size or sophistication. It will be defined by access, and access is now universal. So when you hear the distant buzz of a drone, remember this. It may not just be carrying a camera. It might be carrying the next chapter of modern warfare. One born from desperation, fueled by partnership, and forbidden by conscience.